This revision session is for the 1832 Reform Act and the reasons why it was passed. We're going to look at the reasons why it was passed first, and then in the next session we will look at the consequences. So in your textbook, the causes of the 1832 Reform Act are split up into the short-term causes or the contingent factors and the long-term causes or the conditional factors. And even though that is a useful way of splitting the causes up, I would split them up again into two different types of causes of the 1832 Reform Act. And one can kind of come under the broad heading of extra-parliamentary pressure, and the other can kind of come under the heading of protection of the landed elite. So whereas for the later Reform Acts, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at extra-parliamentary pressure and party rivalry, in the 1832 Reform Act, I think it makes more sense to look at protection of the landed elite over party rivalry. And that's because in 1832, loyalties to parties were much more loose. There was a significant number, over 100, of independent MPs. And even those MPs who were affiliated to political parties, the affiliation tended to be quite loose. There wasn't really much party discipline. And governments often were kind of, in some ways, like some historians have called them more sort of coalitions rather than necessarily being in the hands of just the Tories or just the Whigs. When the Tories in power, which they had been for 50 years by 1830, there wasn't this sort of sense of the Whigs are constantly trying to get into power. The Tory government was the King's government, and the Whigs therefore tended to support the King's government. So I think what we can see happening in 1832 is, rather than competition between the Whigs and the Tories, although there was an element of that, really what we've got is different interpretations of what it means to protect the landed elite. So whereas some people from within the Whigs had one idea of how the landed elite should be protected, and some people within the Tories had a different idea, there was a lot of crossover in that sense. So we're going to start off by looking at the short-term causes, and we are going to look at both extra-parliamentary pressure and this kind of desire to protect the landed elite within those short-term causes. So to work out why extra-parliamentary pressure was building in the lead up to the 1830s and kind of particularly in 1830 itself, that can't be understood without understanding the French Revolution. We saw in the last video that the French Revolution initially led to the prospect for reform being diminished because there was this reaction against from the establishment against the possibility of revolution, reducing their status and wealth, putting them in danger. And so in some ways, initially, the French Revolution made reform in Britain more likely. But over time, the French Revolution combined with two other elements, and the first of those is social change. So from 1750, British urban areas had been growing for a range of reasons, but for our purposes, we can kind of see this as a result of mechanical progress. So the invention of new equipment that would make factories far more profitable than previously meant that for middle-class business owners, there was potential for huge profit to be made in urban centres. And when there was potential for profit in urban centres, there was also potential for commercial gains. So when some groups within the middle class set up factories and made large profits, other groups within the middle class kind of moved to cities to serve the commercial needs of the middle class. So increasing numbers of shopkeepers, increasing numbers of lawyers, doctors, people who could benefit by providing services in these new urban centres. And at the same time, labourers from the agricultural regions moved into cities, partly to take up jobs in these newly established factories and also to provide those other services that the middle class relied on. So working as servants in middle class households, working as skilled labourers to kind of provide the goods that middle class people would buy. So tailors, shoemakers, cabinet makers, etc. So what we see from 1750 onwards, but most intensely from 1800 to 1830, is massive social change. So the growth of the working and middle class as they moved into cities. You can see in the corner down here, this is a picture of Leeds in 1830. If you go back to sort of 1750, 1760, you would not have seen any of these sort of tall chimneys with steam billowing or with smoke billowing out. You wouldn't have seen nearly so many ships. You wouldn't have seen workmen moving around on the quay. Instead, you just had a few streets that were centres for merchants to go and meet and to sell their wool, which was taken from agricultural areas. So in 1830, we've got these large number of economic hubs that were centres of activity and centres for places where middle class and working class people could move. And these groups had kind of independence of thought in a way in the cities that they'd never had in the countryside. And so what you see alongside this social change is an increasing commitment to radicalism in Britain itself. And that was partly a result of the inspiration provided by the French Revolution, partly a result of a growth of these increasingly independent classes. So, for example, working class people were no longer had to be as deferential in order to keep a job. If they were fired from their job for attending a political meeting, they could quite easily find another one unless there was an economic recession. There were plenty of jobs available. In terms of British radicalism, the British political leaders of radical groups, people like William Cobbett, people like Henry Hunt, rise to prominence in the period after the Napoleonic Wars. And you also get a sort of a thriving unstamped press, which is particularly prominent from 1819 onwards. In 1819, the cost of a stamp for a newspaper rises to 4p, which basically means that a newspaper that has a stamp is unaffordable for the working class. So you get these kind of single paper broadsheets, not broadsheets, but like kind of like a pamphlet, but on one page in very small print, which is published, which avoids the rule of needing a stamp. And these are read almost entirely by the working class, but also to some extent by the middle class as well. And that creates this kind of language of reform. More people read aspects of like Tom Paine's work and other ideas, so that by the time the economy starts to do badly again towards the end of the 1820s, beginning of the 1830s, you've got this group that's sort of politically like vocal. They've got the political vocabulary. They're relatively independently minded. And they've got this inspiration of the French Revolution to kind of go off as well. So by 1830, even if nothing else had happened in the kind of late 1820s, 1830s, even if there hadn't been any of these sort of conditional factors or I've just realised I've got my short-term causes here. It should be that, sorry. So even if there had been any of these contingent factors that arose, there would have already been a relatively large pressure for reform anyway by 1830. So if we look at the other side now, the idea that the 1832 Reform Act was caused in part by the desire to protect the position of the landed elite. We have to think about how the French Revolution affected the landed elite itself. And the main reason why the French Revolution had such a sort of strong impact on the landed elite was memories of the Terror, which occurred between 1793 and I don't actually know the date that ended, but for us the key date is 1793, which is when the Terror started, and the King of France, Louis XVI, was executed. You have these growing ideas about equality and fraternity. And that meant that the landed elite in Britain were very aware by, the turn of the century, by kind of the late 1790s, 1800s, that if a similar kind of event, such as the French Revolution, happened in Britain, not only would their lives be in danger, but even if they managed to kind of survive the turmoil of a revolution, their material advantages that they enjoyed in the current British system would certainly have been damaged. So kind of living in big estates like this one, which was the family seat of the Rockingham family. big estates like this that existed all over the country, that dominated the kind of elections in the counties, that tended to dominate the elections in the boroughs as well, though in a different way, that could rely on being able to collect high rents from the that was guaranteed by the Corn Laws, which were introduced in 1815. Dominance in all the major positions of power in Britain, so whether that was in the clergy, in the army, the navy, or in Parliament. The status quo in 1830 was 100% geared towards the material advantage of the landed elite, and therefore there was a sense that any change would damage that. So in the long term, we have this kind of a situation where there's a growing desire for reform amongst non-voters, but then at the same time, amongst voters and amongst people who are in Parliament and amongst that landed elite, there's this real sense that revolution has to be avoided at all costs. Now, in the period between 1815 and 1820, this attempt to avoid revolution manifests itself in the form of absolute refusal to consider reform. However, as we move into 1830, there's a growing number of people within the landed elite who are starting to argue that actually the best way to avoid any damage to their material kind of benefits or that the aristocracy enjoy, and any the best way to avoid the terror or a similar kind of thing to happen in Britain would be actually to have moderate reform, to kind of put off that extra parliamentary pressure and weaken extra parliamentary pressure by having some level of moderate reform. So that's what we start to see in the 1830s, and certainly, or by the time we get to the 1830s, certainly that's not coming from the whole of the landed elite, but it is coming from people in the very kind of high aristocracy, who were on the Whig-leaning side of politics. And it's also coming from large numbers of the landed gentry as well, who were more, who could kind of see this growing pressure for reform and who were keen to prevent any revolution from happening. And if that meant gradual reform, then they were prepared to accept that. So let's have a look at what this actually looked like in terms of the events leading up to 1830. What do we start to see happening as a result of this extra parliamentary pressure and this desire to protect the landed elite? In the 1820s, extra parliamentary pressure actually takes the form of a campaign for religious reforms. Although the religious reforms that were eventually passed in the form of the repeal of the Tests and Corporations Acts and Catholic emancipation, those reforms didn't really have that much of a material impact. Although it was seen as kind of a great victory for Catholics, the significance of these religious reforms was more symbolic than it was kind of actual or political. And the symbolic impact of these early changes, and if you want to kind of read more about them, pause your video now to read about the 1823, 28 and 29 events. This has huge symbolic impact because it builds a sense amongst those Whigs in the House of Commons who are arguing for reform, and amongst people outside of the House of Commons who are arguing for reform. It builds this sense that reform is possible, that change is happening, and we get this growing anticipation of change. Now, for supporters of reform, and we've got, a wide range of different people who were pro-reform for different reasons. But for supporters for reform, they get hope in the 1820s and this sense that change is possible and that change is going to happen. At the same time, the government, with Wellington at its head, is weakened by these religious reforms because it creates a huge amount of anger in the Tory party who oppose any kind of policy that will weaken the Church of England and the established church. So the anger in the Tory party means that some Tories actually split off and start arguing that electoral reform will protect the Church of England. So Wellington is put in a pretty weak position because people who would traditionally be on his side of avoiding reform have started to actually argue that reform would be a good option, and people who are typically not on his side are actually growing in strength, and they are kind of more in tune with public opinion at the time. And then things kind of really become heightened in 1830. And I put the months on here, kind of the January formation of Birmingham Political Union, July, the Second French Revolution, and the Swing Riots. And then we get the death of George IV, followed by an election which lasts until September, and this new government which is formed in this kind of environment of increased political debate and increased anticipation of reform. You can see that basically over sort of six to 9 months, we've got this rapid build-up in political discussion, political agitation, and, you know, there's meetings being held across the country. Those meetings are attended by both middle and working class people. There's the violence of the Swing Riots. There's these news stories coming in from France about violence there, with the overthrow of the re-established monarchy in France. And there's this growing sense that a revolution is really likely. And this causes a huge amount of fear. And there is most of that fear is coming from the establishment, so the landed class. And although there was fear in 1815 to 1820, the fear in 1830 is actually expressed in a different way. So although in 1815 to 1820 the government seemed incredibly strong, incredibly capable of dealing with agitation, the agitation was mostly coming from the working class, and there was a readiness to use the armed forces against any working class protesters. That feeling in 1830 is very different for a number of reasons. First of all, the government in 1830 were unwilling to use the armed forces against any protesters because of a fear of repeating Peterloo. Second, there are a large number of middle class wealthy people who were working with working class agitators at this time, and the middle class campaigners are actually directing a lot of these meetings, and that makes the meetings far more dangerous. The French Revolution, when it was first started, was started by the middle class, so that feels far more dangerous. And also, whereas the Lord Liverpool government in the period 1815 to 1820 was incredibly strong, Liverpool was a figure that united people rather than dividing them, and he seemed very capable of guiding his party sort of through this difficult, or his government through this difficult patch. Wellington did not seem like that at all, and in fact he seemed completely out of touch with public opinion, and he seemed to be making the situation worse rather than better. So the situation in 1830 seemed much more dangerous than that in 1815 to 20. And actually, the landed class are so scared by Wellington's seeming, his kind of accidental whipping up of this frenzy outside of Parliament when he says that he thinks that there's no need for reform. They're so scared by this that they actually have a vote of no confidence against him, and he loses that vote of no confidence. And Wellington is removed. And so what we've got in 1830 is this growing sense among the landed class, and not all of them at all, but a growing number of people amongst the landed class that think that actually the threat of revolution is so strong that potentially a reform is needed in order to avoid that. And therefore in 1831, in late 1830, when Grey, a Whig, forms his government, he feels confident enough in March 1831 that he will be able to pass a reform bill. And he introduces a reform bill that will enfranchise members of the middle class. And when he introduces this bill, he says very clearly, this bill is an aristocratic bill. It is a bill of the landed class, and it is designed to protect our influence. It is to avoid revolution. It is not to encourage demands for further reform. But just because the bill is introduced in March 1831, that does not mean by any means that reform is inevitable. So now we need to look more at the kind of at the events of 1831 and 1832 to see why the Reform Act is eventually passed. Okay, so just before we move on to look at the events of 1831 and 1832, I just wanted to recap the kind of causes that we've seen so far. So we've got within the kind of factor of extra-parliamentary pressure, we've got the symbolic victory of religious reform. We've got the kind of added danger of middle and working class collaboration, which makes the extra-parliamentary pressure much more threatening for the elite. We've got the swing riots, which kind of give this real sense of the potential of violent revolution. And that is added to by the Second Revolution in France. So there's this real sense in 1830 and kind of 1831 that this extra-parliamentary pressure is much more dangerous than it was in 1815 to 1820. Plus, at the same time, we've got the kind of weakness of that group of the elite that is arguing that reform is unnecessary. So for members of the aristocracy who are kind of inclined to resist reform, Wellington was almost their sort of the person to rally around, and he's shown that he is too weak to be able to lead a government. He's too out of step with political opinion. He's actually more dangerous to be in power. And therefore you get the kind of victory of Grey and Grey's ability to portray himself as someone who wants moderate reform, someone who wants to retain the power of the aristocracy rather than reduce it. So if we look at extra-parliamentary pressure in 1830, reform is looking increasingly likely. And also if we look at the actions of the landed elite in 1830, reform is looking increasingly likely. So let's look at what happened next. So far we got up to the point where Grey had just introduced his first reform bill. His first reform bill passes through the House of Commons once, but it fails on its second reading, so Grey resigns. However, in September 1831, there's this crucial event because Grey wins an election. Now, this is crucial because what this shows is that Grey's reform has the support of a cross-section of society. Now, it's not only middle-class people and working-class people who don't have the vote who are clamouring for reform. Clearly, people who are normal, ordinary voters, so members of the gentry, prosperous farmers, people who own landed estates, these are people who are also supporting reform. So Grey has clearly managed to convince the electorate, not just working class and middle class people, but the electorate that reform is needed. Now that makes it increasingly difficult for those members of the aristocracy and those members of the House of Commons who are resisting reform. It makes it increasingly difficult for them to do so. That means that when Grey introduces his second reform bill, it is more likely to pass through the House of Commons. It's still very difficult to achieve. It passes through the House of Commons by one vote, and that's its second reading. So one of the reasons for that is because Grey continues to threaten revolution. So he continues to tell people, look, if you don't vote this reform bill through, we are going to end up with an increase in violence, and we will very quickly be in the situation that France was in back in 1789. Now, even though it's passed through the Commons, and even though Grey's sort of threats of revolution has won over an increasing number of the landed class, the House of Lords still are keen to delay. And in October 1831, we get a really crucial aspect of our extra-parliamentary pressure, and that is the violence that took place across the country over the winter of 1831, most notably in Bristol and in Nottingham. And that violence is really useful evidence for Grey because he has been threatening a revolution all along, and now he has his proof that if the landed class resist any kind of reform, whether it is even a reform as moderate as what Grey is suggesting, Grey says all we need to do is this moderate reform and we can get rid of this violence. And this convinces the House of Commons and members of the House of Commons and members of the landed gentry even more so that reform is necessary. But the House of Lords are still kind of stalling. And so Grey has to basically say to the House of Lords, look, if you're not going to pass this bill, I'll have to create more peers. But when William IV refuses to do that for Grey, Grey ends up resigning. Now, this is when we get a key event that is more important for the impact that it has on the crown in a way than it is for the reform itself. Because what William IV then tries to do is to get Wellington to form a new government. And Wellington, even though he's not particularly keen, is prepared to do that and to do what his king has asked him to do. But then what you see is more proof of this fact that Grey has won over a cross-section of society, because middle-class people are furious that Wellington is being asked to form a government, despite the fact that Grey has clearly won elections. And so they try and take all of their savings out of the banks to try and prevent this from happening. And that is combined with Peel's refusal to serve alongside Wellington, which would basically make it impossible for Wellington to kind of govern in or have any impact on the House of Commons. So this is a really important event for the power of the monarchy here, because what William IV realises is that when there is a cross-section of society that believes one thing, and that includes the electorate, that includes the middle class, and it includes the working class, that when that cross-section of society is all for one particular issue, in this case reform, the king kind of has no choice but to back down. And this is actually what happens. Now, if Wellington had been able to form a government, William may well have got his way, and reform might have been avoided. But because this, it was not only non-voters but voters as well who had been convinced by Grey's argument that revolution would happen if there was no reform, William IV has to back down. And so in June 1832, William agrees to create more peers if necessary, and when the House of Lords hears that this is possible, they give way and allow the bill to pass. So as you can see, in the events of 1831 and 1832, we've got this growing two factors which end up becoming more and more aligned. So they're not aligned in their aims, but they're aligned in their idea of what the solution is. So as 1831 and 1832 goes by, more and more of the population become convinced that reform is needed. Whether they're convinced that reform is needed because they can see that they're not represented by Parliament, or they're convinced that reform is needed because they're trying to avoid a revolution, whatever the case is, more and more of the population are starting to clamour for reform. And some of those people express their view by voting for Grey, and some of those people express their view by going out and taking over Bristol for 3 days. But whatever it is, there's this growing growing extra-parliamentary pressure. And at the same time, there's a growing realisation amongst the elite that Grey's threats of revolution could well come true if the reform is not passed. And eventually, even William IV begins to accept this as well. So when we think about why the 1832 Reform Act was passed, we've got these two sides. We've got growing acceptance among the population that reform is necessary, and then a growing acceptance among the landed elite that reform is the only way to avoid revolution. So then we just have a final question to answer this key question here. So why was the 1832 Reform Act passed? We need to ask, which was more important? Was it extra parliamentary pressure, or was it a desire to protect the landed elite? Well, in this case, it's undeniable that it was extra parliamentary pressure that was the determining factor in the passing of the First Reform Act, or the Great Reform Act as it was also known. Although there had always been from the Whigs, there had always been this argument that reform and moderate reform would be a good way to protect the interests of the landed class moving forwards. The Whigs didn't get their opportunity to govern and their opportunity to introduce those reforms without the removal of the Tories. And ultimately, the Tories were only removed from power because there was this growing extra parliamentary pressure for reform, which Wellington was seen to be unable to cope with. So without growing extra parliamentary pressure and without the growing threat from outside of Parliament, Grey would never have found his way into government, and Grey would certainly not have been able to pass a reform bill. Even with the growing pressure of revolution, it was very, very difficult for Grey to pass the bill. He had to try twice to get it through the Commons and then try twice to get it through the Lords. So without that extra-parliamentary pressure from the outside, the Reform Act could never have passed. So the extra-parliamentary pressure was the reason for the introduction of the Reform Bill in the first place, and at the same time, extra-parliamentary pressure was the reason for the bill eventually being passed. So hopefully that allows you to complete your notes to answer this question. Why was the 1832 Reform Act passed? If you want to have a go at doing a little bit of an extension task, why don't you write, you would never get an essay on the Reform Act as just one essay, but see if you can write a point evidence explain for the 1832 Reform Act, explaining what the influence of extra-parliamentary pressure was in the passing of reform in 1830 to 1832. The next video will be on the impact of the 1832 Reform Act.